when we look now the situation, what is happening in the world, we can see that we are living, well, we can say probably one of the most problematic times of 21st century. This is global pandemic, which I think makes a great impact or influences us, everybody of us, our lives, our activities, our jobs, our economy, our social life, how we communicate with each other, and of course it influences also the politics. And the politicians, they have a great challenges in the next in the near future, and of course currently also fighting with these problems that we have now in the world because of pandemic. It is my great pleasure to introduce you our speaker tonight, Professor Yves Meny, who has been here in Tallinn, also visiting us this year in February, when we had a conference on populism also in Tallinn University School of Governance, Law and Society, among other well-known scholars all over the world. Again, we discussed the issues of populism. And populism, of course, is also rising its head, as we all know, in current political scale globally. There are certain populist movements, and not only movements, but it has become a sort of real politics of several countries all over or different countries of the world, and great powers also of the world. So we have to keep on our eye on the populism as well. And of course, I think also pandemic and populism is influenced by the developments of the pandemic, and what kind of influences we will have. We don't know much still yet. We can because we haven't had a very long time this pandemic yet, but still I think we can already make some preliminaries. That's why this event is also called Populism and Pandemic and Populism Preliminaries, so that we can make some preliminary assumptions out of it. And Professor Meny is very well-known, internationally well-known academician. He has served as a president of European University Institute since 2002 till 2009, and now he's an Emeritus President of European University. And he's also a former president of Tallinna School for Advanced Studies in Pisa, and he was elected chair of the ECPR Executive Committee in the year 2000. And his academic career includes positions in Rennes, Paris, Sciences Po, and the European University Institute. He has taught in many American and European universities, and is an honorary member of the Irish Academy. And of course, he has published extensively in the field of French and comparative politics, public policies, and administration. Later on, his publications he have focused on corruption and also on populism. His latest publications deal with European integration issues, in particular the democratic deficit questions and the tensions between European Union economic monetary policies and national welfare and democratic systems. So it is my great pleasure to give now the floor to Professor Meny. Maybe just a few remarks also about the organization of the seminar, or how we will how we will manage the seminar, so that Professor Michelle will speak around 40 minutes. Then we have two commentators. Also, one commentator is Michelle Everson from London, a professor of law at Birkbeck College, University of London, and Ahto Lobjakas, who is political analyst from Estonia. He's one of the most well-known political analysts in Estonia, I have to say, and he has served also as the correspondent for the Free Europe Radio Liberty in Brussels, and right now also very well-known columnist of the daily newspaper in Postimees, and has worked in many radio talk shows dealing with current political issues and the most topical problems in the society that we have today. So then, after Professor Meny's presentation, we will listen to commentators, and then we have time for questions and discussion. And the questions, please write in the chat window. You can see the chat window in the Zoom on the bottom of the program. You can see the chat. You can write the questions there, and then we will collect the questions and start giving floor to each person who wants to participate in discussion and ask questions. So, but Professor Meny, it's my great pleasure to welcome you here in Zoom, and here you're in Italy, we are in Estonia. I think we have people from a lot of other countries of the world, so it's kind of new reality that probably we have to accept nowadays. So, but Professor Meny, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Indrek. You have been very generous in your presentation, including about the time you have allocated me, because initially I was told talk about 20 minutes and you double the proposal by moving to 40 minutes. So I might make a compromise between the initial 20 minutes and the final 40 minutes. But let me say that I accepted your offer, your proposal to talk about pandemic and populism, in spite of the fact that we are in the middle of the storm in many ways, both as far as the pandemic and populism are concerned. But on the other hand, this is life. I think sailors embark on the sea, whatever the weather is, they have to cross the Atlantic. And let's say that we have, even if we do not have definite answers, we have to try to understand the unfolding of events. And I have to say that there is a convergence of two events which are in many ways exceptional. And if we can see the second slide, you have the convergence of two unique phenomena. Populism first, because populism was a kind of a peculiarity of American politics. And not only it was a peculiarity of American politics, but it was a peculiarity of American local politics. Up to the Trump election, it has never, no president of a populist origin has really been able to be selected first and elected then. But from the 80s, 90s, populism has become a global phenomenon. However, it's a global phenomenon which has very strong national peculiarities. Probably that the main common denominator between the various forms of populism is that they propose an alternative definition of what we call democracy, and they insist very much on the initial meaning of democracy, that is the power of the people, while we know that the democracy as they were built over the 19th and 20th century were a mix, what I call a bricolage, various heterogeneous elements which have been put together and which are made of pure democratic elements, liberal elements, and also a very important heritage from the past, including, for instance, heritage from authoritarian or even dictatorial regimes. Just an example about it, the welfare systems in Europe have been, for most of them, initiated or developed by authoritarian regimes. And it's not a surprise if, for instance, the populist regime in Poland presently is insisting very much on social welfare policies in order to guarantee some political support from the mass of the population. But the new phenomenon is that this populism has expanded everywhere in most democracies, and it's also in line with the fact that the democracies have expanded in numbers over the past 25, 30 years. In particular, today in Europe, you could say that most of the governments are democratic, while 30 years ago, there was probably half of Europe which could not be defined in that way. So that populism is a new phenomenon as far as it is not confined by the American borders. And obviously, America, and especially after the Trump election, is a kind of model, a point of reference for many populist movements, considering that the largest democracy in the world, or at least one of the largest, is or was rather governed by one of them. The second extraordinary event we are going through is the pandemic. Obviously, it has taken everybody by surprise. And there was nothing equivalent, nothing such as this pandemic since the Spanish flu after the Second World War, after the First World War, excuse me. But this event tended to be a bit forgotten by everybody, by historians, by politicians, etc. First of all, because there was a deliberate will by the powers of the time to hide this terrible flu after the tragedy of the 4 years of war. And it's so obvious that this flu, which was not Spanish at all, was called Spanish because Spain, which was not at war, was one of the few countries talking about the flu. The other countries were trying to hide the truth, in particular the United States, France, or Great Britain, or Germany, because they were at war. So we have today the convergence of two phenomena which are absolutely unique. And I would like to remember that globalization, which started in the 19th century in the years 1870, 1880, saw the emergence of populism on one hand, and the end of the first globalization because of the First World War. The Spanish flu was not the cause of the end of globalization, it was the war, but certainly that the Spanish flu had its contribution to the crisis that the first globalization had to face. So today, we are in a situation where the world has never been as globalized as it is. We have a global pandemic, and we have also a political phenomenon, populism, which is global by its multiplicity of expression, but which is essentially a national phenomenon, or at least a phenomenon which is framed by national institutions, traditions, and culture. That's the reason why it's so difficult to compare one populism from the other, given the heterogeneity of the political cultures and institutions of the Western world. So let's move to the second slide. These two phenomena are, have some similarities, but in their structure, but also very big differences. The populism is characterized by the search for a strong leadership, by the contempt of elites, of the experts, by the critique of global institutions, by the claims that people should have more voice, or by unmediated relationship, and also by the importance and the influence of social networks, because probably for the first time, the populist movement and the populist parties have the possibility to be in touch with the people, and by this I mean by the mass of the population, and this is totally new. On the opposite, the pandemic is by definition global, because pandemic does not recognize borders. The attempt by some countries to close borders has shown that it was an extremely inefficient strategy. Pandemics underline the role of expertise which is accepted, as it is the case in most European countries, which is criticized and sometimes denied, for instance, in the United States, where the famous, by now, Dr. Fauci was in many instances put aside by Trump, because he was also trying to bring a scientific voice in a speech, in a discourse, which was characterized by populist accents. So a pandemic is global, but again, like for populism, there is a variety of national policy styles, decisions, approaches, and contrary to what happens with populism, pandemics has an impact on multi-level governance, because many actors are global, and decisively global. For instance, the pharmaceutical industry, or for instance, the Health World Organization. So you have global institutions, international institutions. You have important global markets which intervene in the pandemic, and at the same time, you have an extremely, if I may say so, local approach to the treatment of the pandemic, either because one country decides to go its own way, or because within that country, and I think in particular of federal governments or regional governments, these various subnational units diverge over the most appropriate strategies. Next one. Next, yes. So you have, we observe multiple possible scenarios, and extremely contrasted scenarios. For instance, you could oppose international cooperation and collaboration between states versus national closures, for instance, and what I call chacun pour soi, policies that everybody takes care of his own affairs, but does not care about others. And you can see, for instance, the difference between the attitude of the American government and of the European Union from this point of view. The American government was decisively opting for America first, and that's not a surprise coming from Trump. While the European Union, which initially was characterized by a lot of division and of, how could I say, of disorder in the decision making, and for good reason, because the European Union has practically no competence in the field of health. But then the European Union, little by little, was able to bring a bit of order and of cooperation in the initial mess. And what we can observe, for instance, is this is decisive role of the European Commission in ordering vaccines for the European population, negotiating with the pharmaceutical companies worldwide. Okay, so the contrast from this point of view between the states and between the European Union is rather interesting. The same could be said with Brazil, where the president of Brazil considers with some kind of benign neglect the pandemic, while some governors are much more active in trying to fight it. Then a second contrast is in the mobilization of emotions versus reasons, or fake news, conspiracy, and scientific truths. And obviously, it's there that the pandemic can meet populism, because populism relies very much on emotions, on fake news, on conspiracy theory, while the experts which are trying to address the pandemic propose scientific diagnosis, propose scientific answers to the issue, and propose a scientific strategy which is often rejected either by the populist politicians or by the fraction of population which is influenced by populism. Never as today, for instance, has been an explosion of fake news on the social network concerning the pandemic. And I'm struck by the fact that I'm presently in Italy. On the Italian television, you have many doctors or caretakers who mention the fact that they are aggressed, even physically aggressed, by people who pretend that the pandemic is a pure invention, that it does not exist, and it's a manipulation of people by governments, multinationals. Bill Gates is often mentioned as the ideal scapegoat, etc., etc. So never as probably as today, the possibility of disseminating fake news and to develop conspiracy theory has been so important. To face this tragedy, to face this pandemic, you have also a lot of diversified attitudes on the policy side. From, I would say, business as usual, that's more or less the or benign neglect. That is, well, what to make such a fuss about COVID? You know, it's just a flu. Well, that's an attitude which has been adopted by a few, not many governments, but certainly by a certain number of politicians, including populists who see the pandemic as a form of manipulation. Up to the speech by Macron, for instance, during which he repeated 6 or 7 times, "We are at war." And this has been criticized for this kind of warlike discourse, but discourse which has not been repeated afterwards, but which was probably useful in trying to mobilize the population before the lockdown and to convince people not to get out in spite of the prohibitions. And finally, there is also an opposition between state intervention and market interventions, because during this pandemic, what we have observed is a return of the state as a provider of resources, economic and financial resources, and a provider also of healthcare that he was the only one to be able to provide, at least in Europe, because in the United States, it's probable, even if we don't have evidence now, but it's probable that the very high of death during this pandemic is related to the fact that many people, poor people, are deprived of proper access to care in hospitals, which is much less the case in Europe, even obviously if the system is far from being perfect. Next slide. Well, a few hypotheses, given that we are, as I said, in the middle of the storm and that we do not know really where we are going. Well, the first hypothesis that I could try to figure out is that the federations, which are made of a diversity of populist and non-populist governments, are not well prepared to face an issue which requires multi-level strategies or options. And I would like to mention, even if again we are still at the beginning of the observation, I would like to mention, for instance, the case of the US, where it's clear that you have Republican states, democratic states, and they follow extremely different strategies. Obviously, the Republican states have adopted the Trump view that, well, this was just a banal flu. You have the same in Brazil, where a certain number of states have objected to Bolsonaro attitude. You can observe it in Europe, for instance, in Belgium, where in spite of, let's say, a rather successful strategy at the very beginning, well, after a while, the tensions, the usual tension between Francophone and Flemish parts of the country have came back to the surface. It's also true in Italy, where there are a lot of discussion and a lot of opposition by various regional governors to the centralization under the central government of the policy. But what we can, you had even tensions between governments run by the Lega, that is one populist party, and people have opposed, for instance, the strategy followed in Piedmont or in Veneto. So let's say that the situation is probably more confused, where there is this different political assessment between various levels of government. This has not happened, for instance, in Germany, because in spite of the fact that Länder are governed by governments which are most of the time coalitions anyway, the central government is also made of coalitions, which makes things probably easier. with one footnote, that is the fierce opposition of AfD, the extreme right political party, which is more powerful in this former eastern part of the countries. The second hypothesis when dealing with populism and pandemic is, well, are populist governments more responsive to the people's needs? Because you could imagine that one of the main, let's say, assets of the populists is that they listen to the people and they should be capable of addressing more efficiently or more accurately the needs of the people. Unfortunately, I don't think we can answer positively to this question or to this hypothesis as it is shown by the Brazilian or the American answer to the pandemic, for instance. And the third hypothesis is, are populist parties in opposition benefiting from their anti-elite or anti-expert usual stance? Tentatively, I would say no. That is, they have not gained a decisive advantage in objecting to all the policy which have been put in place by various governments in their respective countries. So next slide. No. You had jumped, yes. So to address some of these question and hypotheses, let me put some very preliminary observations. First of all, I'm struck by the fact that most of the opposition parties, whatever their name and their affiliation, most of the opposition parties tend to become more populist. That is, there are very few cases of national unity. There is a rejection of the government policy choices, and these opposition parties are surfing over the complaints of the people. So everything is criticized. You don't lock down the population quickly enough. You lock down the population too early or too late, or it's too much, it's not enough, etc. So whatever measure is taken is in a way rejected by the opposition. I find this probably counterproductive even for themselves. That is, a credible opposition would be much more, let's say, audible if the opposition was capable of saying, well, this measure is correct and I can accept it because it's necessary. There is a state of necessity, we have to face it. And some others are not well adjusted or they are excessive, etc. So I don't think that in many cases the opposition parties, I'm not talking about the populist party, but the opposition parties have been most of the time unable to offer a credible alternative. They have been only critical of governments in place, be they governments of the right, governments of the left. It does not change anything. Populist parties, in my view, when in opposition, have not gained much from their systematic critique of the pandemic handling. For instance, Salvini or Le Pen in Italy and in France have not gained very much. They are popular, but I have to confess that, again, the fact that every measure which is proposed is considered as a negative measure by these populist parties don't sound very, very serious. So there is not a gain. The populists in power have not also been decisively affected by the management of the pandemic. For instance, you could say, well, Trump has been defeated. I don't think Trump has been defeated because of the pandemic. obviously the pandemic has not played very much in his favor, but Trump has managed, in spite of the pandemic, to get 70 million votes in his favor, which says a lot about the routing of the populist protest in America and the values of the radical right. The pandemic should, in theory, should have been decisive, given the negative management of the pandemic. It should have been extremely negative for Trump. It has not been. It's the same. It's the same for Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro has gained popularity in Brazil. Orban is alive and well in spite of the pandemic. And those populists which have lost ground, that is in Poland, for instance, these days, or in Trump in the US, or Johnson in Great Britain, are in trouble for many different reasons, which are only partially related to pandemic and not exclusively to pandemic. Okay, so next. So what I can say is that there is no overall explanation to the relationship between pandemic and populism, because actually there is no single populist strategy or course of action. I mentioned the fact that most national governments have followed different strategies, even in Europe at the very beginning, and the populists do not behave from this point of view in a different manner from, let's say, normal politics. Populists have been extremely, for instance, a populist leader in Veneto has been quite efficient in the first wave of the pandemic, while some others have been extremely bad in managing the issue. So my guess is that populism remains a national phenomenon. Obviously, there is a kind of a global, let's say, chain between populists, but populism remains a national phenomenon because it's related to the rejection of the democracy at its works in this country, in this particular country. Actually, the populist movement have no much idea about how to substitute the present democratic system, apart from rejecting the elites and introducing direct democracy. Well, national phenomenon, but there was a form of global populism, that is the fact that populists of various governments could support them mutually across the world. And from this point of view, global populism, if it exists, global populism is negatively affected by the Trump's defeat, because obviously Trump was a source of inspiration, he was a reference point, he was the leader of the Western world, and for these reasons, for all these reasons, populism in the United States was a kind of lighthouse for the other populist movements. And we had some funny experiences, both in Estonia or in Slovenia, of politicians probably a bit too excited about the possibility of a Trump's victory, and unfortunately for them, it was not the case. Okay, let's come now to the final slide, conclusion. And I would repeat first what I do believe, that is, populism is a national phenomenon before being global. It has multiple causes and forms of expression. And I am also convinced that it would be, like in the United States, it would be a lasting phenomenon, in particular, as long as the issues which have triggered it are not fully addressed. The second observation that in form of conclusions that I would like to make is I'm struck by the strength of the past dependency of each country vis-à-vis the existing institutions, the political culture in each country. In Italy, in spite of the centralization of power under the direction of the present government, there is a lot of deliberation, discussion, compromise, which are part of the Italian tradition. While the French, on the opposite, the French strategy is very much centralized, and it's managed by a small group of persons. Actually, Macron has set up or has revived a council of defense, which was created to face critical situations such as terrorism, etc., in order to deal with the. So, from this point of view, I would say the French are very French and the Italians are very Italian, and the Brits are in the middle of the way, because in a way Johnson has tried to face the situation as Britain would have done it 50 years ago. But unfortunately for Johnson, Britain is not anymore what it used to be. And regional governments in Wales, in Scotland, have reacted very strongly. Even some regions which have no institutional structure, such as north of Great Britain, have reacted extremely negatively vis-à-vis the decision taken by the central government in Britain. So my first impression is that past dependency is a key feature. Well, now, and that would be my last remark, what may happen to globalization in the years to come? Well, I would like to perhaps to tell an anecdote, because when I was teaching to my students about populism, globalization, etc., I was mentioning to them that the first globalization failed and collapsed because and after the First World War. That was the end of the first globalization. And I was often telling them, well, my feeling is that globalization is on a course which cannot be sustained for long, given the negative spillover effect of this globalization phenomenon. A lot of positive effects, but there are also costs, and these costs are very unevenly distributed. So I was, in a way, as a kind of bet, telling the students, I do not know how this extremely fast and radical globalization will end, but certainly it cannot go on like this for ages. And I have the feeling that the pandemic might be these unexpected events which transform globalization. I don't believe, at least for the time being, I don't believe in the fact that globalization will stop from today to tomorrow. Certainly not. The world is too much globalized, and there are too many benefits to the globalization process, so that it stop. It would be stopping globalization today would be so dramatic that I can't even envisage the consequences. But certainly there is a setback, and there is also a return of the state against the markets, because the states are so much indebted. The states have borrowed so much money in order to intervene and support and sustain the economic sector that, as would have said an American sociologist 30 years ago, state is back in The markets will remain certainly extremely strong and vital, but the states are starting to consider that, well, it's nice to use the GAFA and to communicate through Zoom in academic life, but at the same time, these companies may have too much power, they collect too much data. We do not know how they will use this data, or etc., etc. We are trapped in a system where a few companies actually might frame our life. So there is certainly a change in the mindset of many people, and political authorities. We have populism, or not populism, but political authorities will have to take in consideration this reaction to vis-a-vis probably an excess in the globalization boom that we have observed over the past years. And by the way, obviously, some people underline the fact that pandemic is a global phenomenon and that it's a consequence of globalization, which is obviously true, but which also forgets that it's not the first pandemic that the world has suffered from, and that in the past, the Silk Road was also a source of pandemic, bringing some the plague from China up to Venice or the Mediterranean. This is part of an open world, and there is nothing that we can do about it except to try to limit and to control its more negative consequences. Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry not to bring a ready-made solution to the tension between pandemics and populism, but let's hope that it's part of a dialogue and a discussion, because both populism and pandemic are not over. They are far from being over. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Meny. And now I would like to introduce our first commentator, Professor Michelle Everson, who is a professor of law at Birkbeck College, University of London. And she has researched widely across European law, combining elements of public law and also private law. And she's also an acknowledged expert on European Union regulatory structures and risk regulations. So it's my great pleasure to give floor to Professor Michelle Everson, please.
Yes, hello, can you all hear me?
Yes.
I can't quite see. I must admit, I'm a victim of the pandemic. I have too much hair. I can't get it cut. So it's I'm having difficulty sort of seeing people at the moment, but never mind, bear with me, I've got one eye free. I'd like, you know, this is difficult, this is all preliminary, and I think I'd like to start at the very end of Yves' wonderful précis consideration of the conflicting problems of the pandemic and populism. And I think the basic point from now on in is with the globalization. Obviously the populist moment born, there's a paradox there, isn't it? It's born in an international moment. Trump and the Americans, Steve Bannon, support a global populist revival, but the populists themselves are necessarily nationalistic and anti-globalization. So the anti-globalization side of populism versus a pandemic that is global, that is founded in expertise, that needs international solutions. So I think Yves has really pointed towards, you know, the basic question with a globalization under these two competing forces. I would, however, kick off, I think, with a bit of a challenge to Yves and all academics who are looking at populism. Now, I think there is a basic problem, is that populism is also an aggressive, evil, vile, nasty force which has done great damage to an awful lot of people around the globe, which is still doing great damage to an awful lot of people around the globe. And I wonder why we actually give the appellation, give the appellation populist to what are a set ultimately of deeply unpleasant, old generally, white generally, men generally. We'll leave Modi and we'll leave Le Pen out of that. Why do we actually dignify them with the word populist, as if they really have a connection to the very real problems that I think that globalization has created for a lot of people in this world? And I'll come back to that at the end when I talk about the pandemic. The real problems of globalization, the real social exclusion that maybe our reliance upon risk society and problem solving in global politics has created. I'll come back to that, but do the populists actually have anything to do with that? Are the populists really worthy of our attention in those terms? And I don't think they are. I think the populists really we should be looking at in terms of a completely different paradigm, and one that we've forgotten over the last few years, and that's the paradigm of power. What are populists? They are people who seek to grab and exercise power. So, you know, in the general terms of the defining feature of populists, and I think Yves got that down to a T, the defining feature of the populist is the claim to we the people. We are the people, and we give expression to the will of the people. Now, I myself, obviously anti-Brexit, spent a lot of time over the last 4 years stood outside Parliament screaming at the Brexit MPs, the Brexit politicians. We were met on the streets every time we protested, and you can put 2 million people on the streets and you are told you are not the people. You are not we the people. You are the traitors, the elite. So you are being defined out in a rhetorical act, a rhetorical act which grabs the power for the individual in defining who the supposed people are. Now, how do we react to that as academics? You know, this is a basic problem. I think we ultimately, should we be academics at this stage, or should we be joining in the move to remove the populists? I don't. We do need an academic analysis, but then I think we need to make the distinction between the real problems of globalization and the populists themselves. And the populists themselves, we really must put in the context of power. Thinking about that today, how do we define power? How do we define the exercise of power? I was reminded of Stephen Luke's, I think this is his analysis of power, which has simply been forgotten. And I think it is really an analysis that we ought to be going back to and reading. And just to remind everyone that Luke's makes a distinction between 3 forms of power. So the observable power, which is directly exercised on subjects who would behave differently if they had access to institutions and means that would allow them to behave differently. We are, I think, looking at Lukashenko in that situation. We've got him exercising an observable power against people on the streets who seriously are doing their very best to reject this power, but they do lack the institutions, okay, to actually overcome Lukashenko. We also have, according to Luke's, an observable power in terms of agenda setting, you know, so that you constrain the people's choices because you preset the agenda. Now, people can see you're doing that, and I think the Brexit situation is one of those classics. Somehow, through the agenda setting situation, everyone else's concerns have just been disregarded, and it is, shall we say, it's the Brexiters, the exit populists who hold power, because you can't bring other themes to the table. Luke's, however, also has the final form of power for him, the unobservable power, in the fact that terms of debate are usurped such that people don't realize that other options exist. Now, I think we can look at what's going on the social media platforms in terms of this unobservable power. I don't think it's a perfect description of what's going on, but I think it's getting close. There is enormous influence being wielded through Facebook, through Parler, through various of the social media platforms, although some are also an opportunity for countervailing forces. Twitter, I think, will be at that level. But people are being fed information directly to their feeds, directly tailored to their concerns. And is it any wonder that people are walking around denying COVID if they are being bombarded with "you're out of the job because of this, that, and the other," actual mechanisms using the big data to personalize messages? This is definitely happening. And I think we have to begin, let's forget this populist business in terms of these exercises of power. This is nothing but power grab. And I think the response here, we must be much clearer in our response to it. We are under attack by people who would grab power, and we need to think of ways to stop this happening. Whether we go back to old ideas of competition law, that Facebook and such, you know, the antitrust moment, the antitrust moment, Eve, yeah, in the 19th century in the United States against the populist economic forces. Exactly that moment, whether we might not think about doing that, taking on a positive aspect, well, taking on a positive mission to remove power from politics. But let's go back then. I'm going to come back to the pandemic though, because I think, and exactly these, what does this mean for the future of globalization, and what does this mean in terms of, I think, the real alienating forces of globalization? The pandemic, and watching it in its, watching it from Germany. I'm in Germany. So it's another result of Brexit. I've become more German than English these days, but there we are. Watching it from Germany, and obviously watching this being a technocratic response, very much expert-led response to the virus, to the pandemic, to policy making. I think we have all the potentials and all the dangers of science and the risks society are displayed to us in the pandemic. If we remember Ulrich Beck and what have you, the structuring of globalization that said to us, look, this notion of incommensurate interests, class warfare, people who benefit from the economy versus people who don't benefit from the economy, forget all of those forms of social organization, because that's not the way the world is anymore. The world is about problems, it's about risks, it's about let's find a way to deal with these problems. Now that, I suppose, the technocratic impulse, now that is, there's a huge advantage to the technocratic impulse. There are very real problems out there that science, that experts can solve. So insofar as we are looking at a technocratic, expert-led response to the pandemic that really is about defining the problem, solving the problem, fine. However, at the point, and this is it, isn't it? It's the point where expertise or the expert-led solution is used to hide the very real political choices that must be made, yeah, choices that are to the detriment of various sections of society. So I don't know that it's the hospitality industry. It is very much a sort of new working class that is being, I think, most damaged by COVID. If the expert-led debate comes to the point that it hides that choice, and it is a choice, you know, who bears the burden? If that happens, then we see the problems and the dangers of the rational globalization debate and the rational globalization that hides conflict. I would like, and I certainly hope that we can manage that, I would like the pandemic actually to be more a chance for us to put that technocratic scientific impulse back in its place. Yes, that it becomes clear to people, yes, technocracy, science is an aid to us, but it's only an aid to us. It can set up the choices, but ultimately we need a politics that decides between the choices. If we get to that stage, then I think there is hope. There is hope for a civilized future globalization. If, however, again, politics is obscured, choices are obscured, I think we are in that the real populist problem, our failure or our forgetting of the fact that people do have different interests, that different groups do end up in conflicts, and that decisions do have to be made, political decisions do have to be made that can be damaging to certain groups. I don't know, I hope I've got my rather confused thoughts over, and I'll hand over to the next commentator and look forward to the discussion.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. We will now ask our next commentator, Ahto Lobjakas, who is the Estonian political analyst, also journalist, columnist, and has also given a lot of comments on topical issues of current political situation. So, Ahto, I hope you can hear us and we can see you as well.
I can hear you. Thank you very much for this introduction. I'm not quite sure whether I'm censored or off center on my iPad, but these are the times. Anyway, I am not an academic, but I do have a few thoughts after these very thought-provoking presentations, and I'd like to riff on this axis of populism, power, globalization axis that both Professors Meny and Everson have so evokingly outlined. I must say I don't see, or I see no inherent paradox, and perhaps that's because I am not an academic. But I think to give away the conclusion that I'm striving for here at the beginning, I think we live in a world that is increasingly made up of nations where power or structures of power work in increasingly similar ways. So we have perhaps here a linkage between globalization and totalization, but I'd like to return to this point. In any case, I'd like to seize on this root word populism, or more precisely a variation of it, the word public. I think, or I would say that what we're witnessing here is a crisis of public reason. And it's not just 5 years old or even 20 years old, but I'll get to this as well. But it's public reason, I think, is a sort of an overarching notion of something that we have taken for granted for at least 75 years, at least in the West. And Estonia has actually not been parts of the West for that long, but I'm taking certain liberties here. Essentially, it is really a much older notion, going back a few centuries. And for these last few centuries, what we've had in Europe, what we've had in the world increasingly globally, has been the well, I don't know what to call it, but essentially we've witnessed the broadening or the taking roots of an Enlightenment teleology. There's been everything or most of the things that have happened in the world, most of the things that have happened for the good in the world have been about bringing reason to an ever greater number of people, taking them out of the minority, to quote Immanuel Kant. And now, over the past possibly 50 years almost, I'd say, this process is slowly being turned on its head. And we're looking at a world that is more and more public and at the same time less and less reasoned or rational. All of these words mean the same in the end. For example, take the role of experts in the current crisis, like that of Dr. Fauci in the United States. What you see, I think, he is a good example of what happens to experts in politics, or increasingly happens to experts in politics. What you see is the way they get instrumentalized by politics, by politicians. They get turned around, as it were. They're no longer aimed at making politicians wiser, giving them advice on which the politicians need to act because it's rational advice. But these experts, especially these frontline experts, televised experts, are now increasingly expected to sell policies to the public. In effect, leave the public with the impression that they know better than anyone else. And I don't think that is reasonable. Essentially, these experts, especially the ones we are seeing now on our TV sets and on the media, are no longer thought of as instruments of or for reason, but marketing, or they're seen as marketing tools by people in power, by politicians. Now, to come back to a point I made, or part of the point I made earlier, it seems to me that this is not a recent problem. It seems to me that populism as a political phenomenon, especially in the West, is a progeny of a rather long series of crises of what I would call public reason. And these crises are loosely linked, and possibly one has led to another, or at least has had some causal effect on the next crisis. We can probably start with the end of the golden 30 years, very familiar to Professor Michelle, I would assume. We had the oil crisis in the 70s. We then had the end of the Cold War, a different kind of shake-up, which led to pretty much global political instability, to a lot of cultural fragmentation, led to the rise of political Islam, extreme Islam, led to waves of migration out of war-torn areas, which in turn has led to a series of crises of capitalism, or at least a European variety of capitalism. If we think of the crisis that shook the European Union more than 10 years ago. And in this series, or in this row of crises, it seems to me that COVID-19, the pandemic, represents just an ingredient, just another ingredient in what is turning out to be a perfect storm, a self-reinforcing process. And whether these crises are a cause or a symptom of populism is an interesting question. They're probably both, but I don't think this is what is essential here. The issue of the popular, or of what is popular, what the popular is, or what public here means, I think is organically linked to the question of political legitimacy. And political legitimacy has always been and always seemed to be fungible, something that's subject to money and management in turn is being increasingly technologized in our modern world. And it's not just statistics and focus groups that we are seeing as that represent these technologies, but we see I think a subterranean theory of power emerging, technologized expert level theory of power that is being shall we say, or that the masters of which are people like Dominic, I must admit to brain seizure here. The chief advisor of Prime Minister of the British Prime Minister, who's just left office. I forget his name. I'm sorry, but I think he represents a lot of what I see as the problem here. Now, as I said, what we're seeing is a series of crises, and the other side of that coin, the obverse of that coin, is the political power, especially in Europe and in the United States, in more stable societies, but also elsewhere. Political power trying to adopt new economies to respond to these populist insurgencies. And I'd say power is trying to borrow strategies from other spheres, other walks of life, as it were, obviously from capitalism, first of all. Now, Professor Michelle made a very interesting observation earlier. He noted that opposition parties, opposition movements in many countries over the past year or so, or less than a year or so, but anyway, during this COVID crisis, have also tended to adopt populist views and suggested populist measures. They've not been looking for unity, but for power. And I don't think I find that surprising. I think they are looking for even these opposition parties, not looking for unity, are looking for unity, but in a different way. And it seems to me, to bring my rather rambling thoughts to a conclusion here, I think we're living in a world increasingly foreseen by people like Carl Schmitt from the 1930s, 40s and 50s of the last century. All political division in the end aims at totality, no matter how divided the country or a world may look. It is the struggle is increasingly about the same thing, and that is power, that is total power, whether it's at the national level or at the global level, doesn't really make much difference, because total nations are the ingredients or parts in an increasingly total world. I don't see an essential difference between these levels. And power is always total, whether it's national, whether it's global. I see a parallel here with the notion of the popular or the public that I began with. The popular and the public appeal for commonality. And of commonality, you can, in the end, always have only one. There can only be a single commonality, otherwise there is no commonality. And that commonality, as it must be single, must also be total. And if possible, global. At least it will strive for globality. And it will also need to be globally convertible, which is where you get, I think, what is the steering force and role of capitalism in all of this, at the risk of sounding very, very Habermasian. But this is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahto. Thank you for interesting comments. I think, of course, now it's good if Professor Michelle will have his reply to the comments or reaction to the comments, and then we will go further with the questions. If anybody has a question, please let us know through the chat, so that somebody would like to ask the question, and Koido is assisting us in terms of questions, so that then she can open the microphone for the person who actually wants to have or wants to give the question. So, but Professor Michelle, please, your comments.
Thank you very much to both commentators for their observations and hints at my preliminary remarks. For the sake of time, I will focus on two concepts which have been mentioned by both commentators. One is people, and the other one is technocracy. I would say that from the very beginning, from the time when the American Constitution started bravely with the famous "We the people," from the time of the French Revolution, there has been, I would say, a systematic abuse of the concept and meaning of people. When you talk about a majority, you can define a majority. When you talk about the mass of people, you can identify how many people constitute that mass of people. When you refer to people, actually, this concept does not fit with any reality, because the people as a whole, as a single, is never single, is never pure. There is always a more or less important part of the so-called people who disagree. There is never unanimity. And actually, the democratic system stems from the fact that unanimity is impossible in large polities. So you have to go through the representative system, etc., etc. So the people is a fiction. It's an extremely clever fiction. It's an extremely instrumental fiction, but it's a fiction. So it's a fiction for those who govern and who invoke the people, and it's a fiction for the populists, because the populists who pretend to speak in the name of the people actually speak in the name of a more or less large fraction of the people, but it's always a fraction. There is a French philosopher which has, in my view, rather well defined or provided a nice answer to the question, what is the people? And his answer was, the people is the part who wants to become the whole. And I think it's a perfect definition of the use of people in politics. So we must start from the fact that the people is an extremely interesting concept in order to give legitimation to power, but it's an extremely poor concept when it matters when you wish to define what is the people, because the people has no reality. You have, as I said, you have majorities, you have poor and rich, you have etc. But the people is just a concept. So from this ambiguity, it's a fundamental ambiguity, and from this ambiguity, you have on one hand the construction of the democratic system as we know, that is representative system where the people is supposed to choose representatives and be governed by these representatives. And on the other hand, you have the populists who claim that actually they are the people. They are the people. And it's a kind of, if I may use that word, it's a kind of totalitarian approach to the people, because a bit in a way, the Marxists used to say that the proletariat was more or less everybody except a few plutocrats and exploiters. The populists have the same approach by stating that the people is everybody less the elites, the bankers, and the international global actors. So very few individuals are excluded from this encompassing definition of the people. And from these two different approaches, one which is pluralistic and allows representation for giving legitimacy to the governments. The opposition by populists is this total definition of people, which at the end is expressed not by representatives, but which is expressed by a charismatic leader. because this leader is the expression of the totality of the people. He speaks on behalf of the people. He is the voice of the people. So you have an extremely, in every populist system, you have an extreme personalization of power through a leader. Now, technocracy. Technocracy is both a necessity because you have a certain number of technical issues which cannot be dealt with by, let's say, ordinary people. And by ordinary people, I don't speak of uneducated people, but it might be an academic like me, but which is completely ignorant about vaccines. You know, I have to rely on experts in order to try to have an idea about the virtues and or defects of vaccine. But as such, I am not able to. So experts are necessary. But what is remarkable in our societies today is that the experts have taken a role, an importance, which is rather dramatic by contrast with the past. And the experts might be different of those of the past. That is, it's not so much the engineer, it will be the, let's say, the banker which can deliver the right message, or the club of bankers, etc. So the technocrats are both necessary and at the same time tend to become the substitute of politicians in societies which are dominated by expertise or by global issues which cannot be dealt with properly as a national level. And for me, the populism stems from many economic or social problems, but populism stems also from the fact that there is an imbalance, a very dramatic imbalance between what is considered as democratic, that is the expression of the people's voice, and let's say the liberal or constitutionalist component, which is made of, let's say, from a mixed bag of experts, independent authorities, Supreme Courts, etc. Because actually, one of the problems that we are not willing to face today is that the field left to politics, that is to political choice, has been dramatically reduced over time, dramatically reduced by experts or by legal systems. You know, everybody, I think, is in favor of fundamental rights, but we have to face, obviously, the dramatic consequence of the expansion of fundamental rights. That is, politicians have a more and more limited space where they can decide. And so this tension between democracy or democratic politics and fundamental rights is a tension which has always existed, but which has been exacerbated over the past 30 years by the existence of Supreme Courts, because actually before, most of the fundamental rights were just proclamations, they were just declarations. They had no real impact on legal and political system. Today, they have a real impact. And we have to think about this tension. It's a real tension. I'm very much in favor of fundamental rights, but I have also to observe that fundamental rights as such are a narrowing, a dramatic narrowing of the space of politics. Okay, so populists jump into on the train and actually challenge these, let's say, these situations that we have accepted at a time where we have not perceived, let's say, the spillover effect and the conclusions of these dramatic change. To be more simpler, I would say the democratic system are made of the democratic input, the people's input on one hand, and are made of what we tend to call liberal, even if they are not liberal, components, that is rule of law, human rights, technocracy, checks and balances. And this second component has dramatically expanded over the past 30 years, in contrast with the democratic input, which has remained exactly the same as it used to be, let's say, in 1950. So this is a problem that we have to try to solve, and which is extremely difficult to solve. Unfortunately, from this point of view, the pandemic, to come back to the pandemic tends to exacerbate the imbalance rather than to counterweight the past imbalance. The experts are becoming much more influential, much more important, and the reaction to this power of experts are the fake news and conspiracy theories on social networks, because there is no trust in vis-a-vis these experts. And I will stop here because otherwise I would take too much time.
Right, thank you, Professor Meny. Now, there is a time for questions and discussion. We haven't received any question through chat window. I would then ask if anybody has a question, please write in the chat or just somehow let us know. I don't know what other ways we have. We have to let us know who would like to have a question. Then we can turn the microphone on those who. Okay, I heard something from.
Yes,
Okay.
I think there is a question.
Holger, yes, please.
Hi, first thank you for the wonderful talk and the comments. I'm not sure I catched everything in the fast pace, but maybe about the notion of the people. If I understood correctly, you said it's not that applicable, or at least quoted some authors who said it's a fabrication, a construction, and so on. But perhaps we could, in democracy, perhaps we could reconstruct the notion of the people as through some democratic meta-consensus, as in people not agreeing in the specific policies and not having a common identity in being a conservative, a liberal, and so on, but through a meta-consensus of agreeing how we solve our disagreements through some principles and procedures, which we still have a line of we the people who agree that we are going to govern ourselves and as such, and the others who are not the people, who do not wish to participate in the democratic creation of the people, and so on and so forth.
Do I answer?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
You can answer right away, yes.
Yeah, well, this is an optimistic possibility, and I really do wish that different people with different views, etc., can find ways not to agree to the same thing, but at least to agree that they disagree and however live together. Unfortunately, I think there is, and the way of reaching that kind of consensus in the past, in past democracies, was the party system. So the party was acting first as collecting more or less identical views on one side or the other. Then these views were fighting each other, but there was also the acceptation that the winner of the elections could govern in spite of not convincing everybody, provided, and that was the limitation, provided that it does not inflict on the minority choices which would be unbearable. I remember a French politician in 1981, when the socialists came back to power in France after many, many years. One socialist MP made a declaration which was extraordinary because he stated, speaking to the opposition, you are legally wrong because you belong to the political minority. So linking a political view with legal obligation, etc. So this was a terrible rejection, in a way, of tolerance vis-à-vis the opposition. But today we are in a different situation for many reasons. First of all, as you know, political parties have collapsed everywhere. As used to say my dear friend and colleague Peter Mayer, who passed away about 10 years ago, he said, talking about parties and governments, said they rule the void. Unfortunately, the political parties have very little to say today about alternatives to the forms of power of governing the country. And it's a reason why the opposition parties tend to become populist, because they run behind the populists. They try to do as badly as the populists do. And it's dramatic because in a way you don't have alternatives offered by political parties in opposition or by political parties which are part of coalitions. And the fact that the coalitions are good for governing the country, they are extremely bad for offering alternative solutions to the population. But today, so we don't have anymore the political parties. And we observe a technological revolution. We are part of this technological revolution. We are able to communicate from distance through Zoom. But people communicate with the rest of the world, with the rest of the population through internet. So you have an atomization of communication. We do not communicate let's say, to constitute communities of thinking, communities of converging, etc. We are communicating, and most of the people who communicate today on the social network communicate in order to protest, to attack, to deny. Hatred speeches are absolutely terrifying, and all this takes place in an anonymous fashion. So I think the book, which has been recently published by Nadia Urbinati, and whose title, I believe the title she has chosen is extremely is strong, and at the same time gives in a very short, in very few words, a good definition of the present reality. The title of the book is "Hi, the People." Hi, the people. It's not anymore we, the people. It's hi, the people. So, and the populist movement navigates on this extremely fragmented, this fragmentation of positions, this extreme individualization, which ends up with the famous leader, because there is nothing in reality which aggregates, you know, these atoms in society. The failure of the social movement Gilets jaunes in France is the dramatic illustration of the incapacity of these people to express a minimum of convergence on any issue, apart protesting against the government, or invocating a popular initiative, popular referendum, which has been the only, let's say, expression. So I am a bit pessimistic, I have to say, because the populism is not just let's say, a bad moment, a political crisis. It's also the expression, the translation of societies which are today so fragmented that you do not see anymore what kind of social or political glue could put all this population together. That's the drama, in my view, of present times.
Okay, I can see that Michelle has a comment here, and then we have another question, and Ahto Lobjakas also wanted to comment something, so please.
Well, if there's another question, I ought to let it happen, but I wanted also to be a bit more optimistic in the sense that I've also seen, I must admit, on social media, that the counter movements to the populist movement, so that there is a greater access towards global expertise, towards global reason, and I think new emerging communities, that social media, for all that we've seen the evil side, and there really is an evil side to it, there is also the positive side. And in part, you know, the fragmented communities, the passing of our old industrial classes is a very real problem in Europe. You know, the stratified class structures encompassed in the nation that provided our Volkspartei and our big political parties were also, you know, stratification was also unification. Now that is passing, and there are reasons why that's passing, because the class system as it was structured in Europe was also deeply exclusionary. It was exclusionary of the non-European other, it was exclusionary of women. Different groupings, but you see, and again being optimistic, I see these different groupings connecting across borders, connecting with public reason, better than expertise, public reason. And this is also enabled by the technology, and maybe in all this maelstrom, maybe we will have, I think it's an Ahto Lobjakas, it's always the French, yeah, the French who give the best terms, the chain of equivalence. Yeah, that helps us to join together, even though we've got diverse interests, to fill the notion of the people. So there's also an optimism out there, but I'll...
Yeah. The two sides of the coin, yes.
Yeah, the two sides.
Okay, I think Ahto also wanted to comment something. If yes, please.
Yes, I've always, or I've followed this with a lot of interest, and I was obviously this issue of the imperative of aggregation. I think Professor Everson's response pretty much said what I wanted to say in many ways, and said more than I had wanted to say. The point about new communities emerging, I think, is a very valid and a very important point. These notions of commonality, these notions of aggregation, these notions of a whole, popular whole, whatnot, I mean, these represent perhaps older ways of congregating or aggregating, and these older ways of aggregating close off avenues for, as Professor Everson puts it, for new communities to emerge. And I think this notion of everything being in a flux is a very important part of the whole debate here. But I'd like to come back to this point made by Professor Michelle about these fundamental rights, the rise of fundamental rights narrowing down the domain of the political, and that being a problem. I'm not quite sure I can agree here with Professor Michelle. If I take the example, one of the examples he brought, and I apologize, I can't quite remember whether Professor Michelle said it was the Bolsheviks who said that there was the proletariat and pretty much nobody else except for some plutocrats. If it was the Bolsheviks, then there's a problem. But if he said it's Marx or Marxist, then there needn't be a problem. But essentially, if you take Soviet Russia, then besides Bolsheviks or the proletariat and the plutocrats, you had the peasants, a very important part of society, and the entire issue of the civil war in Soviet Russia in the early years had to do with the peasants. And I think that there's an example here, or something, or perhaps a morale that can be drawn from this. Essentially, what these liberal institutions do is they do away with majorities. One of the functions is to not let majorities take matters into their own hands. And I don't see what choice we have in today's world with this eruption of irrationality, with the eruption of charisma that Professor Michelle refers to, the rise of totalization at every level, of people trying to speak on behalf of the people, even if they don't have a majority of the votes, as we're seeing in the United States right now. I think the only hope that we really have at this stage, and the only hope of negotiating this hopeful passage to new communities emerging, is to rely on institutions, nothing else.
All right, thank you for the comment. We have a question from the audience. Anna had a question. She can't use the microphone, I guess, or at least she asked to read the question. So we'll read the question and hopefully we can answer. How do banks in different EU countries calculate the mortgage interest during the pandemic? Is it normal in this situation to calculate the interests during loans payment leave as all times before? ? And there is an additional comment or question from Anna, why the bank authorities do want the same money from people in the global situation. During the payments leave, the main part stands, we have to change this because it is not fair. People cannot pay a huge amount of interest not having their loans decreasing. So this is the question. Professor Michelle or any other comments on that? Yes.
On these economic issues, I'm not an expert, so I prefer to leave the answer to those who feel able to address the issue, because I don't think I can.
Perhaps Professor Everson has.
Yeah, I don't know what's happening in different. I know the idea of the mortgage, a holiday, is very much current, where everything is being deferred by the banks, but that ultimately just puts up your rates in the future. I think there's this sort of futurization of mortgage, of individual rates. I've followed a little bit. There's that interesting question: if all governments are borrowing, who's lending? And what happens in the future? And I've seen a few comments on that in the paper, that actually, this futurization of the debt is fine. I don't quite understand the mechanics of it, but that there is enough private money out there that the futurization of debt doesn't matter. But whether banks will spread the risk between private and public customers, that I really don't know, I'm afraid. Hoping for the best.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
If there is no no other question, I may add a few words to what Michelle said. I think the amount of debt which has been accumulated over the past months is so huge that you have perhaps for once I might be more optimistic. That it's a huge amount of money which has been created by the central bank, and you have several options. The first one is to follow the British way. That is, I think this year Britain has finalized the reimbursement of the debt which was accumulated for fighting Napoleon. It is more or less, it took 200 years to pay back, which means that actually you have paid rates, because the capital which was borrowed in 1814 or 1810 is ridiculous, obviously, in 2010. So you don't care too much about reimbursing the capital. You pay interest over time. But there is another more optimistic option, that is that the central bank has permitted this huge influx of money, and we will never pay it back, which is another option. You know, when people have borrowed up to their eyes, at that point, you know, nobody reimburses. It has happened also for Germany after the Second World War, where Germany was entitled not to reimburse the huge debt the country was supposed to pay back. So it might not be the main issue in the future, except that obviously, let's say for instance, a student who has borrowed money to the bank in order to pay for studies might have problems, because in her case, I think there is no option not to pay back. So that for private people, the situation might be much more dramatic than, let's say, for banks or big companies or the states themselves.
Okay, thank you. I think Tõnu Viik, Professor of Philosophy of Tallinn University, has a question now. Please, Tõnu, the floor is yours.
Hey, hello to everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, hello, Professor Everson and Meny. As I was following and thinking that the coming of populists is some kind of reaction to the shrinking of the political sphere due to the expert politics and technocracy, which is certainly true. And we can see populists as trying to maybe to win back the democratic arena, winning back the politics as something communal, as a place to come together and to be close to one another, to have this one national thing, all of us again. But in another sense, the coming of populists, it still feels like a takeover rather than contribution to the democracy, and it is not so much of the content even of their agenda, but it's the style of their argument, and it's the way of their behavior. And I would say that it is a certain political culture that is alienating and maybe contradicting the very democratic policies as we've had them. The Habermasian way of rational debate certainly is under attack from them. Now, how do you solve this dilemma? On one side, the attempt of widening the democratic arena, bringing in new people, new ideas, maybe perhaps even I don't know, new styles of talking, and still on the other side, killing the democratic culture, or at least harming the democratic culture to the extent that debate is dying out. How do you see this? We very often talk about the option that populism perhaps widens the way we do democracy and enriches our political debates. But can it really be the case because of this alienating culture that they bring along?
If I may.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Well, the bad news is that democracy is going through a crisis. That's the bad news. But the good news is that democracy has always been in crisis. it's a kind of permanent state, because the goals of democracy are so demanding that they can't be reached. Never. It's impossible, because democracy is both a set of institutions and procedures and values and ideals. So because these ideals are never met by any democratic system on earth, there is always a challenge to democracy in order to improve. Some people might be completely wrong in the way they wish to improve democracy, but it's part of the game. It's a risky game, because we know that in some occasions democracies have collapsed. But I would like to underline the fact that democracies are a mix, and are a mix of purely democratic institutions and values, purely democratic or purely relying on peoples, and of non-democratic elements, impure elements, but which are today part and parcel of the definition of any good democratic system. The rule of law has not been invented by democracies. The rule of law has been invented over time by various groups or politicians, etc. Even Frederick II published a book in French in 1780 or 82, advocating the Reichsstaat. Okay, so, but the rule of law today is considered as a fundamental pillar of democracy. You could say the same of fundamental rights. The fundamental rights are a core of values and principles which have as a goal to protect completely this right from violation by, let's say, the people, by the majority. So there is an antagonistic position of the pure democratic principle and of the pure principle of human rights. And the value of democratic systems have been to try to accommodate these two contradictions. I would add a third example. We consider in Europe that the welfare systems are part and parcel of democracies, because we consider that, let's say, equalization of condition is good, because we are all equal as citizens, but we should be also equal or tend to equality in terms of, let's say, welfare. But I think it's not too, it's not scandalous to underline that most of the welfare systems in Europe have been initiated by authoritarian governments, or have been complemented sometimes by despots, because they wanted to buy, let's say, the social peace. So contributors to the welfare system have been, to start, Bismarck, but also Mussolini, but also Hitler, but also Pétain in France. They have contributed to the construction of the welfare state system, and at the same time, we consider in Europe, not in the States, but we consider in Europe that the welfare is fundamental for the good functioning of democracy. So democracies are really a mixed bag of different things, purely democratic and some non-democratic, but constitutive of a well-functioning democracy. And I think the populism is a kind of recall that the balance between democratic and non-democratic elements, the balance today is not the right one. And the upsurge of populism is, as say Michelle, is evil, but at the same time, it's kind of an alarm system underlying that there is something going wrong in the functioning of our democracies. For instance, most of the democracies accept today that 1% of the population in every country possesses 30, 40, 50, 60, 70% of the national wealth. That's part of, let's say, of the system. Obviously, if you are in the 1% or just under the 1%, that's a rather comfortable position. If you are at the bottom of the scale, you can understand why these people say, we want to change. So in the past, we were talking about revolutions. Today, we are talking about populism, which is a form not of revolution, because they don't want really to change the system, but they protest against the functioning of the system. So unless we correct a certain number of deficiencies of the democratic system, we are condemned to live with populism. The big change which has occurred during the last 10 years is that populism was a minority phenomenon, which in the States were limited to the local and state level, while with Trump, it has become national. And in Europe as well, you have a certain number of governments which are populist today. And what is fascinating is that in most of these cases, the populists manage rather cleverly to be both both controlling power and at the same time to be the opposition. That is, for instance, Berlusconi was remarkable in that perspective, because Berlusconi was governing the country and he was the most populist leader you can think of in terms of political speech. So they combine both the protest against the system, what they call the system, while at the same time governing. And Trump in the United States was at the same time, let's say, the person supporting and making possible the continuity of the system while pretending to speak on behalf of the poor, of the working class. That's a paradox.
Yes, thank you, Professor Michelle. Perhaps other presenters would also like to comment on Tõnu's question, or
can I say one more thing?
Yes, please. Yes.
I agree, of course, that democracy has components that are not of democratic origin, as you listed them, the rule of law and human rights and so on. But it seems to me that what we very often miss as a necessary component of democracy is a certain culture, a certain culture of public behavior that actually that cannot be dismissed, as the rule of law cannot be dismissed when we want to have a democratic system. And it seems to me that populists very cleverly, they undermine and perhaps even attack this existing culture necessary for democracy. And that's the real danger of the populist movements, it seems to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I would answer by quoting a very old, let's say, thinker, Aristotle, talking about democracy in Greece. And for him, what was absolutely fundamental and what was making the Greeks different from other people was deliberation, because he was stating, us, the Greeks, Athens in particular, we are able to deliberate. We deliberate, we decide together. And probably what is missing most during this period of time is the culture of deliberation, and a culture of deliberation which is respectful of the opinion of the others and not just a rejection of the opinion of the others. So perhaps should we come back to the Greek recipes of the 5th century before Christ, reinstore deliberation in order to practice democracy.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So, at least we haven't received any more questions. Anybody else would like to have questions or comment? I think we have like 15 minutes till the end.
I think we were getting to the real core of the problem there, the degradation of political community and what the populists have been able to do. Now, I think there are two ways. I mean, what really surprises me, I think, at one level, is the lack of memory. How can the public allow itself, with the historical examples we have, how can the public allow itself to be produced in the way that it is being produced? You know, how can people forget so quickly, you know, what misuse of power is, what the call to we the people. I mean, a more blatant repeat, I mean, we know history doesn't repeat, it rhymes, but a more blatant call to fascistic forces than we the people, I'm not sure that I can think of. So I suppose we in terms of the civility of political culture, we have to think in terms of education and repeating the historical message. But I suspect that, you know, there are the renewal movements, the new groups who are entering politics, that we've seen in the American elections that the vast increase in the number of people who are actually taking part in democratic process. So women, black voters, who managed to get themselves registered and who are bringing new concerns to the democratic table. So I suppose that's one renewal, and a renewal that's built of narrative in a certain sense. It's I think a lot of what is happening within the Democratic Party, and there are the schisms within the Democratic Party in the US, but a lot of what's happening is a narrative of inequality. You get the groups who are actually telling the world what is Black Lives Matter, what is wrong with the status quo. And that in itself, narrative is I think a civilizing force. And also I think regionalism, that democracy comes down to a lower level. The Scottish independence movement is one that really impresses me because it's not nationalistic. It really is a civic moment that says, here locally, we need better solutions for our community. And that's sort of maybe the localism, the new groups, and a renewed historical education might be, I think we have to take steps now. We have to take active steps to re-establish the civility of political culture. It is difficult from a left-wing perspective to simply accept liberal, non-majoritarian structures, so in that they have their own problems. The private sphere is the sphere of the market is a troublesome sphere, an anti-democratic sphere, but there are maybe more republican in the Greek sense, republican elements that we can look to, and for me that will be historical education, new groups, and regionalism, localization.
Okay, I think Professor Massimo Latorre would like to have.
He had disappeared. I'm glad that he has come back.
Yes. I was wondering who is this number 23230 is, but it's Professor Massimo Latorre. So
yes.
We're happy to discover it now. So Professor Latorre, the floor is yours. If you would like to have any questions or comments, please.
Thank you very much to Professor Michelle for his extremely interesting discussion of populism and pandemics. I think it's a huge, of course, question. We are in the middle of the storm. We don't know what will happen. And So we are confused actually. We are locked down and there is a lot of confusion. I would only say, add something, I think, to the definition of populism, and which we tend to forget. I think one element that helps to understand the populism is to remember that our society is now based on a permanent, a sort of permanent show. So in this sense, I remember when I was a student, I read a book I liked very much, I must say. It was La Société du Spectacle by Guy Debord. It was an extreme, it was an extremely radical and book, I think written in 65, 67, 66, preparing the 68 wage or protest. But it was an extremely intelligent book. Still is an intelligent book. And the analysis was that we are living in a society where what happens actually is mediated through a show. And this show is fundamentally is the emergence of television, and now we have internet, we have the smartphone. So through a screen, we have between us and the reality, there is a screen. Actually, you know, another author, a philosopher that I like very much, I must say too, I think Guy Debord was basing on his analysis, is Günther Anders. Günther Anders was a German, actually was the first, Hannah Arendt first husband. And Günther Anders has an incredibly intelligent book written in the 50s called The Old Quality of Being a Man, the old quality of being a human. So being a human is becoming something obsolete. Humans are obsolete. And humans are obsolete because humans were based, being a human was based on touch humans. We touch people. We are socialized by having a direct contact with our mother. With our first experience in life is actually touching a body. We touch a body. And but now this touching is becoming more and more obsolete because we touch reality through a screen. Okay, so and Anders builds a theory on this fact. Okay, and now I think populism is, in a sense, the type of politics that is appropriate to this show society, to this society of a permanent show. Because, you know, and there are proofs of that. I think this is can be empirically demonstrated by the two fundamental cases of populism I would modern, contemporary. I think the first one is Berlusconi. Berlusconi is fully a populist, in my opinion. I don't know whether Professor Michelle would share this view. And the other populist is, of course, is Trump. Now, both of them, in different ways, are showmen. Remember that Trump built his popularity through a show, The Apprentice. So without The Apprentice, he was the big figure of this show for nearly 20 years in the United States. Huge popularity, making also a lot of money. Actually, his fortune, many people say, is based on this show, is still based on The Apprentice. And The Apprentice was a show in the TV, was TV, and it was a reality show. It was a reality show. No. So populism is, I think, corresponding to politics as a reality show and the politician as a showman. Now, of course, to a showman, a showman is moving your feelings, and you may have the idea, the feeling that you are directly connected to him through the screen. You see someone in the television, you like him, he appeals to you, and you may believe that there is a strong direct connection between this person, this figure, and yourself. Of course, this is not true. It's absolutely untrue. This is absolutely fantasy. And I think this would explain very much lots of populist phenomena. I think, of course, there is much more, but this is a fundamental phenomenological situation of our society. We are fully embedded. We are fully embedded in. And so we shouldn't forget that. What about pandemics in this situation? Now, you know, and this is, pandemics is very good to feed populism, because pandemics creates fears, creates bad dreams. We don't sleep well. I don't sleep well in this month. I'm not sleeping well. We are fears. We are fears. We don't know what will happen. So we are becoming irrational more than usual. And this is, of course, it's very good for populism. We can be easily prey of populistic protests, appeals, and so on and so on. So this is a dangerous. Pandemics is very good for populism. So we are in danger. But on the other time, you know, there is possibility that pandemic is bad for populism. I don't know. We are in the middle of the storm. Because when people are ill, the screen is no longer important. So I mean, you are again touching people. So if my mother is, or my daughter, or my friend is ill, or I am ill, and the screen is, pandemic is no longer a show reality. Reality is no longer a show, it's a serious reality. And I'm back in the real world. I'm back in the real world. And the real world is made of people suffering, people, you need to care from other people, you need touching, you need to be touched, you need to be touched. You are longing to be touched, especially if you are ill, and so on and so on. So what I want to say, I don't have clear ideas. I suppose nobody has clear ideas about what is happening now. But I would say pandemic on the one side can feed and exacerbate populism. And this would be real danger. But on the other side, there might be hope that since the screen is no longer something important in front of illness, that illness is too direct to you, that the screen is no longer there. The fantasy of the show will no longer be effective. So I don't know whether this is useful in the discussion, what I'm saying, but this is just what I wanted to comment. And thank you very much, Professor Michelle. Thank you for your excellent, wonderful discussion.
Thank you, Professor Lobjakas. Professor Meny, maybe you would like to have a quick reaction to Massimo, and then I think we probably have
very short one. I think Massimo put rightly the finger on the fact that through the screen, there is a kind of direct relationship between the individual and the leader, or the illusion of a direct relationship. And it's what I call the Uberization of politics. That is, we are now in a world where we do not need, or we think we do not need mediation in every sector of life, of our private life, but also in public life, which means the collapse of political parties. And as far as the signs of hope are concerned, my view is that probably the best recipe to fight populism is to try them, because once you have tried them, you have understood what populism is about. And the Americans have tried Trump, and I think they have understood what it means, or at least a majority of the population has understood what it means. And it's the same in many countries. Either the populists accept to enter into mainstream politics, which might be also the end of the story, and they can accede to power. We have a beautiful example in Italy these days with the Cinque Stelle. They have accepted to compromise some of their principles, so they are in the government. They are losing as many votes and support as it is possible to conceive. There was a beautiful satirical drawing this morning in Corriere della Sera, playing on words, and I don't know exactly how to translate it, but in Italian it's Cinque Stelle, the name of the party, to Quattro Gatti, which means 4 cats. That is, practically there is no support at all except a few cats, you know. So from Cinque Stelle to Quattro Gatti, which is, in my view, the fate of most populist parties. That is, unless they become authoritarian, as it is the case in Turkey, or we could be in Brazil, perhaps. But if they don't become authoritarian, I don't think they can survive very long, because they can't deliver. They can't deliver what they have they were committed to during their electoral campaigns. They are very badly prepared to govern. So I'm not that pessimistic from that point of view, but as there is an expression in French, it's un mauvais moment à passer. It's a short period of bad time to get through, but I don't think that the populist form of government is sustainable. It's impossible. It's not sustainable. So either it collapses or it becomes a purely authoritarian regime. Full stop.
Okay, thank you. With this statement, I think it's very good to put an end to this wonderful and very interesting and fruitful, academically fruitful seminar. Thank you, Professor Meny. It has been, like always, great pleasure to work with you. And also commentators Michelle Everson and Ahto Lobjakas. We definitely would love to have you back sometime in the next academic occasion or seminar or conference or whatever other form of cooperation we might have. Just for the information, everything has been recorded, so it will be available for a wider public for academic reasons also. So and everybody, of course, can look it over and have their own thoughts, and maybe also there might be some follow-up in articles or some publications even. So many thanks to you. I think this event has been a great success in terms of audience. We were a bit suspicious that how many of us will appear here actually, but I think total number we had, the best number we had was 81 together with Zoom and Facebook Live. So I think for such a small seminar, I think it's quite a rather good result. So again, thank you everybody, and hope to see you soon again.
Thank you to you. Thank you.
Bye bye.